Hey everybody, today I'm going to show you how to do some testing in DBT. So what are tests? Tests are select statements, just basic SQL, that perform quality checks on your data. They triangulate bad data, they ensure data integrity through the transformation process, and they can be applied and run automatically. How does that happen? These select statements are going to return rows that would break assumptions about your models or rules about your models. So, for example, if you had a primary key and a primary key, you're not supposed to have any duplicates. You can test for that. Essentially, that test will look for duplicates. If there are any, it will return it so you know what data is being duplicated, if there is any data that's being duplicated, and from there you can kind of work to see what you need to do to fix it. There are a few different types of tests within DBT. The first are native tests. Those are not null, unique, accepted values, and relationships. These tests come built into DBT already, and we kind of just explained the unique one in the previous slide actually. There are also singular tests. These are custom tests that you're going to be writing yourself. The thing about these tests are they run for a specific model or specific columns. It's kind of like a very specific niche case when you create these tests. They can't be applied for different models until you turn them, or if you can turn them, into a generic test, which are the last type of test. Where now it's kind of more dynamic. You can use these tests for multiple different models and even for multiple different columns that you want to test for. Native tests are actually generic tests themselves. They're only called native tests because they come built into DBT already. But again, these native tests can be applied to different models, different columns. You just need to configure it within your YAML files. So where do you configure these tests? These are going to be configured within the properties.yaml files. And again, these are YAML files that live within the subdirectories of your main models folder. And it's going to be responsible for the configurations for all the models that live within them, including test. So how do you configure test? Well, you're going to have to use the test property within those YAML files that I specified within the previous slide. Here's an example. So if we're going to run it on the orders model, we have models here and the name is orders. The column that we want to run the test on is order ID. And then we can specify the test. And the test will be not null. So if there's any nulls in here, they'll get returned and we'll know that the test failed. Okay, so here I am within DBT Cloud, and I'm going to be working with a model that I previously created already. It's called funnel data grouped. Essentially what it gives me is a breakdown of spend, impressions, and clicks per channel in total, right? So just making up a scenario, imagine I knew I spent $200,000 or less on the channel Facebook. And I want to make sure that this model isn't showing anything over 200,000 because that would be incorrect. I can go ahead and create a test for that. So I'll go to my test folder here. I'll create a file and I'll just name it channel spend. And these are going to live as SQL files, so add the .sql at the end. And let's go ahead and make our test. Again, tests are going to be select statements. And these select statements are going to return rows that go against our assumptions of the data or the assumptions of the models that we've created. So let's go ahead and reference that model, ref, funnel data group. And within the where clause, I'm going to put the logic that's going to go against, again, the assumptions about my model. So I'm going to put spend is greater than or equal to, or just put greater than actually, because 200,000 is okay, but anything greater than 200,000 is bad. And for the channel, Facebook, right? So let's go ahead and save this, and I'm gonna run this. If it returns any rows, then I'll know that the test failed because there are rows that are going against our assumptions. And if it doesn't return any rows, we know the test passed. So as you can see here, it returned a row. Facebook actually has 227K in spend, which is not accurate according to the kind of case I just made up on my own right here, where I know I only spent at most $200,000. So what we just created here is what we would call a singular test. And a singular test is going to validate data or test for a single model. It's a very specific use case. Now, every time we run DBT test here, it will run through all of our singular tests that live within that test folder. As you can see here, like we just saw it returned one row, so it failed. Now, the next thing we're going to do is try and turn this singular test into a generic test so that we can start using this test on different models or columns. So let's move on to generic test. These are going to live within the test folder, within the subfolder generic. So let's create a file here, and let's do generic test. Just keep it simple. That's equal. And we can use the same code. We're only just going to make slight alterations to it. But what a generic test needs to have within it is test here. So you know that it's a test, and we'll name it. Let's just name it the same thing, generic test. And then we're going to put parentheses because we're going to be able to add parameters for whatever column we want to run it on or whatever model we want to run it on. And then we'll also need to tag it with end test. So we have the same thing here, but let's say we want to be able to choose our model for what we want to run it on. We'll just add it through here. And then we can remove this, which is the model we're currently running it on, with model. And then to go further, maybe we want a different column that we want to run it on. So instead of spend being over 200,000, we can change it to whatever we want. So let's do column name. And instead of spend, we'll go column name. Now we have a generic model, a generic test. Okay, now that we have our generic test created, we're gonna need to configure it because right now when we run DBT test, it's just gonna run all the singular tests. And that's because these singular tests already have which model and columns that they're supposed to test on. But when we look at the generic test, DBT is not going to know which model or column that we want to test right now. So we need to configure that within the properties.yaml files. Again, these YAML files are ones that live within the subfolders within your models folder. And yeah, let's get started. So let's do models. And what's the name of our model that we're working with? It is funnel data grouped. And this model has columns. Which column do we want to work with? Let's first do channel, let's put name. And the spacing here is important, guys. So definitely pay attention. Test, which test do we want? There are other generic tests such as accepted values. So I know that we only ran on Google, Twitter, and Facebook. So let's put those values in. Facebook, Google, and Twitter. Oh my God, I'm sorry, guys. There we go. And let's do one more test. Let's just call it not known. Again, if these tests return any column or any rows, then I'll know the test failed. And let's do another column. The column that we really want to focus on, that we're creating our generic test for, Let's do spend just to keep it consistent. Test. And our test name is generic test. So before we run this, accepted values and not null are also generic test, but you don't see them within this generic test subfolder. Why is that? That's because these, along with a couple other examples that I had in my slides, are considered native tests. And native tests are generic tests, but these are tests that come built in to DBT. So it comes with DBT out of the box. You can also edit these, but that's for another day. What we want to focus on is our custom generic test that we created here. And again, that will live within the generic test folder. So let's go ahead and DBT test this. And we should have 4 tests running now because there's one singular one within the test folder. And then we applied 3 generic tests here. So let's go. Okay, we only have 1 singular test running. That means I configured this wrong. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, so just some errors that I had here. I spelled columns wrong. Gotta fix that. I also spelled the table wrong. And this has to, test accepts a list, so it has to be a list here. So quite a bit of errors, but now it should run. DBT test. And again, 4 tests should run. There they are. And 2 of the tests fail. Again, these are actually the same thing. Our singular test, you can see the code compiled here. Spend is greater than 200,000 for the channel Facebook, and you can see the model here. And our generic test, let's see the details here on how the code compiled. Same thing, right? And that's because our generic test is smart enough to pull the column here. It's under columns, right? For spend. And it will replace that with spend. And that with spend. And it's going to do the same thing for models. So models, name of the model, final data grouped. And it's going to replace this, as long as we configure it within the properties.yaml file. So we learned what DBT tests are and what they do, as well as why you should use them. We learned about the different types of DBT tests, so singular, native, and generic. We also learned how to configure DBT tests. So those are configured within the properties.yaml files and are configured using the test property. And we learned how to run DBT test using DBT test.